Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, North America, A Different Perspective. My name is Desiree Littman, and I'm the Program and Marketing Assistant here at Times Journeys. During the next hour, you'll learn more about our tours to Yellowstone National Park and New York City. Each of these tours gives you a different look at what North America has to offer, from beautiful national parks and wildlife to the exciting scene of New York City theater. During this webinar, we'll hear from Jim Robbins, a science writer and Times contributor, joining our tour to Yellowstone, and Scott Heller, the deputy editor of Arts and Leisure of the New York Times, who will join our tour to New York City Theater. We also have with us today Samantha Barry from our tour operator Academic Travel Abroad, who designed both of these programs. Thank you everyone for being here today. Samantha has worked on some of the country's most prestigious nonprofit theaters with some of the nation's foremost theater directors, playwrights, designers, and actors. The passion which drove Samantha to pursue theater is the same one that inspired her to explore educational travel, storytelling. There's a symbiosis between why people travel and why they see theater. It is about exploration, curiosity, and seeking a deeper understanding of the human condition. Samantha is thrilled to bring her producing expertise to creating the perfect match between traveler and experience. Before we begin, why travel with the New York Times? First of all, each of our departures is accompanied by a New York Times journalist or subject matter specialist. We offer over 55 itineraries, including land-based trips and specialty cruises on world-renowned cruise lines. And we visit diverse destinations that tell a story and explore topics such as history, culture, or politics. Each of our trips offers exclusive access so you can escape the crowds and enjoy access normally closed to the public. We'll begin with our journey, Winter in Yellowstone and the Tetons, where you'll travel deep into Yellowstone, over snow-packed roads, and explore the wilderness and see one of our greatest ecosystems on full display. To give you just a brief overview of the itinerary, this is a 7-day, 6-night tour that begins with your arrival in Montana. You'll travel to the Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, and cross the Continental Divide over the course of the tour before returning home on day 7. Included in the cost of the tour are most of your meals, your tour manager and local guides, and most transfers. During the tour, enjoy highlights such as exclusive access to sites at Yellowstone and viewing wildlife in their habitat as few can see them. You'll hike geysers and springs of Yellowstone and take a horse-drawn sleigh through the National Elk Refuge, where over 7,500 elk spend their winter. And you'll get unique insight from your time-selected specialist. I'd now like to introduce you to Jim Robbins, a science reporter who has written on science and environmental issues for the Times for over 35 years. He has also written 5 books, including one about Yellowstone National Park entitled Last Refuge, Environmental Showdown in the American West. And he has led our previous tours to Yellowstone. Thank you, Jim, for joining us today.
You're welcome. Well, I guess on the first day, we'll be driving through the Paradise Valley, south of Bozeman, toward Yellowstone Park, and staying at Chico Hot Springs, which is a beautiful resort about a half hour north of the park. This valley, the Paradise Valley, is filled with wildlife. So even before we get to Yellowstone, we'll start to see wildlife, elk, perhaps, bison. It's really quite a stunning part of the world. And then once we get up into the park the next day, that's really where our chance to see wildlife increases. Elk as well as bison. A lot of times in the wintertime, the bison can only move down the roads because there's no snow. And so they'll get out in front of the bus or cars and block the road, and we get a really close-up look at these animals as they try and get out of the way and run down the road. Lots of elk in Mammoth Hot Springs, which is where we enter the park. Won't see bears. They're hibernating this time of year. But the other kind of main attraction on this day is the Mammoth Terraces, which are hot springs right near the entrance to the park. And we take a hike up this boardwalk through this field of hot springs, and um, it's really quite a beautiful walk. It's a day walk, maybe a couple of hours. And it's really one of the highlights of the trip. Then it's on to the Lamar Valley. Also, that's where we also get to see wildlife, uh, large numbers of bison, elk perhaps, and hopefully wolves. That's where most of the wolves in the park are seen. And we'll spend the day with binoculars and guides trying to spot wolfbacks along the Lamar River in the Lamar Valley. And then I would say my favorite part of the trip is Old Faithful. Um, we'll be staying at the Snow Lodge near Old Faithful for a couple of days, so we have lots of time to investigate this area. Old Faithful Geyser is the most famous part of it, and it goes off just as regularly in the wintertime as it does every other time part of the year. Sometimes if it's cold enough, it explodes, steaming hot water explodes, and then the water falls back to the ground as ice, and you can not only see it, but you can hear it. It's quite a treat, but it has to be 30 to 40 below zero. So last year at Old Faithful, I think it was 20 below, was as cold as it got. Although our winters aren't nearly as cold as they used to be out in this part of the world. In addition to Old Faithful, I should say Old Faithful in the summertime is often crowded with people watching it. But in the wintertime, sometimes there's just a handful of people, which really makes it quite a nice bonus to go in the winter to see it without the crowds. But another part of a visit to Old Faithful is the Geyser Basin. It's called the Upper Geyser Basin. We do a hike through the snow around the Geyser Basin, and we look at a number of different geothermal features, dozens of them, and they're just gorgeous. They're hot pools and other geysers and mud pots, and it's really quite a treat to see all these things, especially in winter when they're steaming and really stand out. Blues and greens, turquoises, oranges, the color of some of these features, and they really stand out in the snow. That's a picture of actually that's Mammoth Terraces near which I first mentioned. Upper Geyser is not in this picture, but this is what it looks like as well in the Upper Geyser Basin. At this point, we're riding on snow coaches or snow vehicles. I'm not sure what they'll be having this year, but they're vans with tank treads, kind of rubber tank treads that travel over the snow. They also have vans with large, oversized agricultural tires that do well on the snow, and it's quite a treat. We see a lot of wildlife. Last year, we saw river otters and elk, and I think a fox, and it's a really remote part of the park at a very quiet time of the year, and so there's lots of scenery and wildlife, and we kind of have it all to ourselves. And then toward the end of the trip, we stay in Jackson for a couple of days, a couple of nights, and I guess the highlight of that trip is the sleigh-drawn or the horse-drawn sleigh trip out to the National Elk Refuge. Because they feed elk here right next to the town of Jackson, literally a stone's throw away, they get thousands of elk in the winter that come down to spend the winter, and they take us out on sleighs and right amongst the elk. I mean, I wouldn't advise it, but you can almost reach out and touch some of the elk. It's through this huge herd of elk, and we go right through the middle. Mountains are in the background, the town of Jackson. It's really it's quite a stunning trip, part of the trip. We also stop at at a wildlife museum not far from the Elk Refuge, and it's really a world-class wildlife art museum, and we spend half a day there. And then Jackson itself has a lot to offer. The food in Jackson is really, for a small town, is really well done, and a wide variety of things from sushi to Italian. And walking around the town is a lot of shops and things to see. So Jackson's where we end, and it's also, I think, one of the highlights of the trip. And on the last day, everyone flies out of Jackson back home.
Thank you so much, Jim. This is going to be a really incredible tour for anybody who wants to get out and experience the beauty of these national parks and these nature preserves. So just to recap, this tour has departures on January 3rd and 9th in 2017, and it is limited to 25 travelers. This is a 7-day itinerary with a cost of $4,495 and a single supplement of $1,185. If you want to learn more about this tour or want to book a spot on it, please visit our website or call our call center. So now let's journey on to the East Coast to take a look at our tour behind the scenes of New York theater. During this 6-day backstage journey, you'll meet with the creators of New York theater, visit some of Broadway's hangouts, and learn about the inner workings that come together only when the curtain rises. During this 6-day, 5-night tour, you'll be staying in New York City at the Intercontinental Times Square. And included in the cost of the tour are your tour manager and local guides and some meals. During this unique tour, you'll get the chance to immerse yourself in some of New York's finest theatrical offerings from prime seats. Participate in exclusive discussions and seminars with theater insiders like a director, producer, casting director, actor, choreographers, designers, or stage manager. Experience stages of the theatrical process by attending a reading, a workshop, or an invited dress rehearsal. And get a glimpse into the after-show world of theater makers at their favorite haunts and dine pre-theater in some of New York's premier restaurants. I'd now like to introduce Scott Heller, who is the theater editor of the New York Times and was previously the arts editor at the Boston Globe and a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan. He will be joining our January theater tour. Thank you for being with us here today.
It's good to be here.
So now I'm going to hand it over to Samantha and Scott as they take you through the itinerary.
Great. Thanks so much for being on this webinar. We're very excited to talk to you about this trip. One thing that you'll notice is that we have 3 different departures that Desiree will talk about at the end, the departure dates. The one thing to know about each of these is that none of them are the same, because theater is a very of-the-moment kind of thing, and it's an ephemeral experience. It's best experienced when you're in the room, and so it's something that I've had the pleasure to work with Scott on curating this experience. So really what we're going to be focusing on is the January departure, which Scott is the expert, and he and I have been working out all of the details of and continue to. But what hopefully it will do is whet your appetite for, if you're interested in March or November, to sort of get a sense of what kind of access we're providing, what kinds of shows you're going to see. Everything that Scott has chosen, there's a reason to see it. So we're really trying to build the narrative, not just of seeing theater in New York, but what's the process? What's the process of how a show comes together, and why is it important to see these shows? You're not going to see something that's been running on Broadway for 10 years. That's something you can do on your own. But really, for Time's Journeys, what we'd like to do is provide this unique opportunity for you to go behind the scenes and experience what it's like with this access and with these shows. So the first day you'll arrive in New York on your own and gather that evening for a welcome dinner and reception at Sava Lounge, which is in your hotel. The next morning, what we're trying to do is really build that page to stage idea. So you'll start your morning at Manhattan Theater Club, meeting with Jerry Patch, who's the artistic development consultant, and he has worked on new plays for probably about 50 years. A ton of Pulitzer winners, a lot of new playwrights, a lot of established playwrights. He's sort of the go-to guy. So you'll have the opportunity to have a private discussion with him about working with playwrights and what happens in the beginning stages of a play. Later that afternoon, you'll have a chance to go to the Drama Bookshop, which will be celebrating its 100th anniversary. It is the absolute go-to shop for all theater makers, and my guess is you'll probably see several actors in the shop, but they're no guarantee.
It's also right across from the Times, so that may make a little drop into the Times pretty easy.
Oh. And that evening, Scott and I are working on having you go see a reading, which would be also a really great opportunity for you to get a sense of what theater's like during the process, because as you'll see throughout the week, there's the experience that happens once the show comes together and it's on Broadway, it's off Broadway, but there are all of these other steps that happen along the way. And for any theater enthusiast, it's great to sort of know how how everything comes together. So we're working on providing a reading that night so that you can get a sense of what that step is like.
I mean, most theaters don't have performances on Monday nights, so Monday nights become a night when things get tried out and read and practiced. People are invited to see works in progress that they might invest in, or to see what it's like to hear a play being read and then decide to add it to their formal schedule down the line. So what you might be seeing in this case is something that won't reach a stage for months or a year away, but you would be part of an early audience to get a sense of how it goes from being on the page to what it's like being presented to an audience. It'll be very bare bones, probably just with music stands, but very much part of the process of how theater gets put together in New York.
So the next day, you're going to get a sense of what it's like to be a theater hooker. Now, before you get scared off, there's no experience required, and you don't have to own tap shoes either. But we're going to have the incredible opportunity to have you in a private tap class with Derek Grant, who is a former member of Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk, and who's also, he's been a choreographer on stage and on TV. And he's an incredible tap dancer and a really generous guy. And he's very excited to sort of bring you into the world of dance. So you can do it yourselves. Later that evening will be the first play that we're going to see, which is August Wilson's Jitney. And I'll let Scott talk about why that was chosen and why it's sort of a great choice for this trip.
August Wilson is one of the great playwrights of the 20th century and is especially known for a 10-play cycle on the African-American experience. It's called, people refer to it as the Century Cycle. Many of his plays have been done on Broadway, but Jitney is one that has never been done on Broadway. It was only done off Broadway more than a decade ago. And this is a chance. It's going to get its first Broadway production, which for people who care about Wilson and people who care about Broadway is actually a really big deal. It's going to be done under the auspices of the Manhattan Theater Club, I believe, and it's going to be directed by Ruben Santiago Hudson, who's an actor and director who over these last 5 or 10 years has really been strongly identified with Wilson. He directed a version of Wilson's play, The Piano Lesson, a few years ago that I saw that was easily one of the best productions of its year. And what it seems like Ruben Santiago Hudson is going to be a great person to give Jitney the kind of high-end production and allow it to cast some of the best actors in the country for Broadway. As the theater editor of the Times, I'm very curious to see who those actors are. I know there's a lot of incredible talent that always wants to participate in Wilson plays. And so any day now, I'm waiting for them to announce who the cast is. But that Ruben Santiago Hudson is the director is really a good sign.
And the other thing is that after Jitney, we have arranged for a backstage tour with the stage manager. So you'll be able to see really behind the scenes. The next day, what we're going to do is it'll be a 2-show day, but not in a conventional sense. The first thing we're going to be doing is going to Lincoln Center to see a production of Greenberg's The Babylon Line. And Scott, why don't you discuss why that was chosen and anything about the play?
Richard Greenberg is, he's in a way, it's like an old-fashioned writer, the kind of writer that Broadway really used to be especially popular on Broadway. He writes sophisticated kind of comedy dramas. He's won awards for his play about baseball called Take Me Out a couple of years ago. And The Babylon Line, I've read, it's extremely funny and it's touching, and it's about a writing teacher who teaches sort of an adult education class in the late 1960s in suburban Long Island. He's kind of like a little bit of a beatnik or a wannabe beatnik, but to make a living while he's working on his endlessly delayed novel, he teaches a class to a group of suburbanites at a time when the country is changing dramatically. And Richard Greenberg really has some great, I think, compassion for people who are sort of caught between one way of thinking and another way of thinking, and sort of an old model of sort of old world manners and new, and the way that the country is changing in the late 60s is really a moment for that. So he finds, I think, a lot of comedy, but also a lot of compassion in the meeting of these students, many of whom are suburban women, and this writing teacher who wants to urge them to kind of go more deeply into their own experiences and even their own frustrations and put them on the page. What's also nice about it is that it has a really terrific cast. Lincoln Center always casts their productions beautifully. And you have, in the role of the writer, you have Josh Radnor, who you probably know from How I Met Your Mother on TV. And then it has a terrific cast of character actresses playing many of the women in the class. So it reads terrifically on the page, and I think it'll be a really beautiful to watch on stage, too.
Thank you, Scott. From there, we're going to go to Feinstein's 54 Below, which is a relatively new but much celebrated supper club where we'll have a chance to see a cabaret act. I'm really excited because the way the timing worked out, and part of, as you'll see, a lot of this is juggling schedules. So the backstage tour for day that we have on day 4 maybe happen on day 4 for the March departure, for example, but we have it on day 3 for this one. What I'm really excited because Tracy Toms is going to be performing that evening at 54 Below. She will have just closed Falsettos a couple days before. You may know her from Rent, and she's a phenomenal musical theater actress, and I think is going to put together something really special for her cabaret act. So we're going to have dinner there, see the show, and then have the full immersive experience. We've arranged to have Tracy come and meet our group after the show.
54 Below is like a great new development in New York theater. It's become almost like a little bit of a clubhouse for performers, people, and it also, what it's done is it prompts people to think about developing cabaret shows, to sort of tell their own stories. And I spent a lot of time there, maybe more than I should, and it's going to be fun to meet with a bigger group. I think you'll find it sort of has a little bit of a glamour to it. Food is good, and it's also very homey. You'll find a lot of people know each other, and it's a fun way to feel like you're kind of stepping into the New York scene.
The next day, we're going to have a couple surprises during the day. We're trying to pinpoint exactly who, but we're going to have our travelers have a master class with an actor which should be a really great, unique opportunity. What we're really trying to balance with this is your ability to see shows, to understand shows, and to meet with the artists who make shows. So that should be a really exciting class to have. After to do our farewell dinner before seeing Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. I'm really excited about seeing this show. I'm going to hand it over to Scott, who can talk about why this show was picked. But I think it'll be a great capstone to your experience.
Sure. Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 is sort of a state-of-the-art show for this year's Broadway season. A lot of you, I'm sure, know about Hamilton, which was the talk of last year's season. And like Hamilton, Natasha Pierre is a show that is a little bit experimental and brings to Broadway a sort of musical styles and an experimental approach to what kinds of stories you can tell in a musical, and how you can tell it. It started at a tiny, tiny theater way off Broadway, moved to a tent, and now is getting a Broadway run. And so that's really interesting. And I'm hoping we can talk about the increasingly different ways shows make their way to Broadway. This is an absolute example of that. It couldn't have started in a smaller environment, and it also took a couple of years to get to Broadway. Part of what makes it interesting and not a kind of show, not the kind of musical you think of, or not the kind of subject matter you think of for a musical, is that it's based on War and Peace. And before you get scared off, it's actually only based on a sliver of War and Peace, but it's a part of the book that the composer felt really deserved to be musicalized. And he's done it, but he's done it using a musical language and a style that's very pop-oriented. It's not old-fashioned. It's not grand and orchestral. It almost feels like a pop musical and has almost sometimes a feeling of electronic music in places and folk music, and yet it's telling a story about the Russian aristocracy. So it's a very interesting mix and match, and I think that'll be pretty provocative from the get-go. The other two aspects of it that I think are going to make it really much talked about are they've committed to staging it in a way that tries to mirror the feeling that the show had when it was in the tent and in the very small theater. And in those places, you were sitting at tables, they were serving vodka. It was basically meant to be set in a Russian nightclub. And what the producers have done, and they've spent some money on this, and I've gone and watched some of the construction happen, is they've taken a pretty traditional Broadway theater and they've sort of stripped it and they've rebuilt pieces of it and they've rebuilt the stage and pushed the stage out into the audience and they've rehung lighting. And so the whole feel of stepping in there, and I don't want to kind of ruin it, but I think the idea is that when you walk into that theater, you don't feel like you're in a Broadway theater. You feel like you're in a very different kind of space. I think they will still be serving drinks depending on where you're sitting. They serve pierogies to try to convey the Russian feel. So the experience of being there is not like your typical Broadway experience, and that's partly because I think Broadway producers recognize that people are hungry for something new on Broadway, and Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet is one of the real examples of that. The other thing they've done, and this is part of how Broadway works these days, is they realize that people want to see stars. And so what they've done is that they found out that the pop singer, Josh Groban, the pop singer Josh Groban was an enormous fan of the show when he saw it off Broadway, and they had an elaborate series of negotiations. We talked about it in articles in the Times, and they've now recruited him to be in the show. So it's his Broadway debut. He brings with him an incredible fan base, but he's choosing to make his debut in a show that's a kind of somewhat experimental, kind of risky and adventurous show. So it's a kind of interesting match of exciting material, an unusual presentation, and a big star. And that, I think, is the way shows get made these days. You have to figure out ways to put elements together and reach an audience that might feel like Broadway isn't for them, or that they've seen it all before. And Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 sort of promises to experiment in a way that is still going to bring a popular audience in, and that's the interesting risk they're taking, and I think it's going to be exciting to be there for it. And simply as a musical experience, the music is terrific. So, and Samantha, you have a one of the behind the scenes people definitely coming. Is that right?
We do. We have Mimi Leanne, who is the set designer, and as Scott was talking about, part of this experimental idea of working and bringing something from a really small space to a Broadway stage, she's done an incredible job with this vision of the set design. So we thought that she would be an incredible person to speak with, and she will be joining our group for a post-show reception at the Glass House Tavern, which is one of Broadway's favorite haunts, I have to say. So you'll probably, by that evening, be such a Broadway insider, you'll be able to name everyone who you see at the tavern.
It is.
She'll be joining us as well.
I mean, Mimi Leanne is kind of an amazing story. I mean, she really came from the fringes of the theater world. She worked in small, unusual spaces, and then her work was so undeniably special, and her vision was so unusual that she's gotten brought into bigger and bigger projects. And along the way, and this is really a first, she won a MacArthur Genius Grant. So she's that level of talent. And this just hasn't happened with anyone who's been a set designer, as far as I know, almost ever. And so this is really her chance to work on the biggest possible scale. And I have to say, having seen her work on smaller scale, she absolutely delivers. And so I'm excited myself. I think even having seen the show a couple of times in other spaces, I think what she can do in a Broadway house with that kind of budget will be pretty different.
And that's the trip. The next day, people can go back home at their leisure, or if you want to stay in New York for a couple more days and use all of your newfound knowledge about how plays come together to see some shows on your own, you're welcome to do that as well. We have some rates negotiated with the Intercontinental, so that if you wanted to stay, you could do so.
Thank you, guys. This sounds like it's going to be a really incredible tour full of lots of exciting and unique ways to experience New York theater. So just to recap once again, this tour has departures on January 8th and March 5th and November 12th in 2017. And the group size is limited to 25 travelers. This is a 6-day tour starting at a price of $4,995 with a single supplement of $1,100. And if you have any questions or would like to book, you can visit our website or call our call center at 855-698-7979. So now let's just go over some of our frequently asked questions about our tours. First of all, is airfare included? We do not include this in the cost of the tour, since this allows our travelers to use points and miles when booking their flights, which we found is often the preferred way to book their travel. What is the physical requirement for the tour? We recommend that you are able to walk for 3 hours to ensure your enjoyment of the tour. Obviously, each tour differs in terms of how much walking you'll be doing. And lastly, what should you pack? So these are obviously very different tours, so the packing list will differ from each other. But before your departure, you'll be given a detailed list with everything you'll need to pack to ensure you have all the necessary items for the trip. So now we're just going to open this up to audience questions. If any of you have questions you'd like to ask, you can type it in the side panel of your screen. So now we have a question about would these trips be appropriate for school-aged children? And I guess that can apply to both trips. Sam, do you want to answer that?
Sure, absolutely. I think in terms of depending on what age the student is, I think that for someone in elementary school, for example, the theater trip may not be the best one. I don't see why Yellowstone couldn't be. And I think any theater enthusiast in junior high school, and beyond would absolutely be welcome on the New York theater trip. So either one, I would say high school age for either one, and certainly younger for Yellowstone.
Great. And we've had another question come in asking, what kind of seats can we expect for the theater tour?
So we have orchestra seats for all of the shows. Natasha Pierre, as Scott was saying, has a really interesting stage layout. We got premium seats for that show, and so they'll be part of that sort of on-stage flex seating. So there's probably some vodka in our future on that one, but we've really tried to get the best possible seats for these productions.
Next question. So someone wants to know why the play lineup isn't announced farther in advance for these tours, for the New York City theater tour.
That's an excellent question. As I sort of alluded to at the beginning, part of the excitement of the New York theater tour is that we really want to see what is on and what is important to see. So I've been talking to Scott about what is new, what's important, what's exciting to see for the January trip. Patrick Healy is going to be the expert for the March trip. And so he and I will be in discussions about that as well. So much of it is because we want to make sure that we're really telling a story with what the trip is. We want to figure out what kind of access we can get for the different shows, and really to make sure that what we're providing is not just a theater experience of you buy a ticket, you go see a show. We want to provide the greater framework for what all of that is. And so part of that is really curating the experience and having your experts and I work together to make that experience really special, so that the January trip is not going to look like the November trip. It's a different play lineup. There are different artists involved. So we really want to sort of highlight the of the moment aspect that theater can provide.
Great. And then we'll just wrap up with one more question. For the Yellowstone tour, how will the group be transported around Yellowstone Park?
So there are different varieties of snow coaches and snow vans, depending on the day. They all have tracks, and when you're journeying from Mammoth to Old Faithful, you're in smaller snow vans, and then on that first morning, then the first morning is a larger coach, but all of them are specifically winter vehicles.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Samantha, Jim, Scott, for being with us today. It was really a special experience to hear from all of you about these incredible trips, and I'm sure any one of these is going to be an amazing experience. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.